The tropical heat was suffocating. The kind of heat that made breathing feel like work, that turned clothing into a second skin of sweat-soaked fabric that clung and chafed. In the city of Manila, capital of the Philippines, the air was thick with humidity even in the early morning hours, and by midday it became almost unbearable, a physical presence that pressed down on everything and everyone. The smell of the sea mixed with the scent of the city, salt water and fish markets, tropical flowers and diesel fuel, cooking fires and rotting vegetation, creating an olfactory landscape that was uniquely Filipino, uniquely Manila. In a modest wooden house in the Ermita district, not far from Manila Bay, a young woman stood at the window watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her name was Carmen Rosales, and in the spring of 1941, she was 27 years old, a nurse at the Philippine General Hospital, and someone who believed deeply in the ideals of service and duty that her profession represented. She was petite, barely 5 feet tall, with the dark hair and warm brown skin common among Filipinos, and eyes that seemed to take in everything, that missed no detail, that saw not just what was in front of her but what lay beneath the surface. Carmen had been born in Manila to a family that straddled 2 worlds. Her father was Filipino, a doctor who had studied at the University of Santo Tomas, and who ran a small clinic in their neighborhood, treating patients who couldn't afford the fees at larger hospitals. Her mother was Spanish, the daughter of a merchant family that had been in the Philippines for 3 generations, and she had brought with her a sense of European culture and refinement that she tried to instill in her children. Carmen had grown up speaking both Tagalog and Spanish, had been educated at Catholic schools run by Spanish nuns, had learned to navigate between Filipino and Spanish identities, between the indigenous culture of the islands and the colonial culture that had dominated them for over 300 years. The Philippines in 1941 was a complicated place, a nation caught between identities and allegiances. It had been a Spanish colony for over 3 centuries, then had been ceded to the United States after the Spanish-American War in 1898. For over 40 years, the Philippines had been an American territory, promised independence but not yet granted it, governed by American officials but with an increasingly autonomous Filipino government. The relationship between Filipinos and Americans was complex, a mixture of gratitude for the promise of independence, resentment at continued colonial control, admiration for American ideals, and frustration at American condescension. Carmen embodied these contradictions. She was grateful for the American-style education she had received, for the opportunities that American governance had created, for the modern hospital where she worked that had been built with American funding and expertise. But she was also aware of the ways Americans looked down on Filipinos, the casual racism that permeated colonial relationships, the assumption that Filipinos were not quite ready for self-governance, not quite civilized enough, not quite equal. She had chosen nursing as her profession because it seemed like a way to serve, to make a tangible difference in people's lives. Her father had wanted her to become a doctor like him, but Carmen had seen how exhausted he was, how the weight of responsibility wore him down, and she had chosen instead a profession that allowed her to care for patients without bearing the ultimate responsibility for their lives. She was good at her work, patient and skilled and compassionate, and she had quickly earned a reputation at Philippine General Hospital as someone who could handle difficult cases, who remained calm in emergencies, who could be trusted. But in the spring of 1941, Carmen was restless. The world was at war, and the Philippines sat in the middle of an increasingly dangerous situation. In Europe, Germany had conquered most of the continent and was locked in a desperate struggle with Britain. In Asia, Japan had been waging war in China since 1937, had occupied French Indochina, and was clearly preparing for further expansion. The Philippines, with its strategic location and its status as an American territory, was directly in Japan's path, and everyone knew that war was coming. The American military presence in the Philippines had been increasing. General Douglas MacArthur had been appointed commander of U.S. Army forces in the Far East, and he was working to build up Filipino and American defenses, training Filipino soldiers, stockpiling supplies, preparing for the invasion that seemed inevitable. Carmen watched American soldiers in the streets of Manila, young men far from home, and she wondered what would happen when the war finally came, whether the Philippines would be able to defend itself, whether the Americans would really fight for these islands or would abandon them as strategically unimportant. Carmen had tried to volunteer for military nursing service. The U.S. Army was recruiting nurses to serve with military units, and Carmen had applied, thinking that if war was coming, she should be part of the effort to care for wounded soldiers. But her application had been rejected. The official reason was vague, something about quotas and qualifications. But Carmen suspected the real reason was that she was Filipino, that the military preferred American nurses, that despite all the rhetoric about Filipino-American partnership, there was still a hierarchy, and Filipinos were at the bottom of it. The rejection had stung, had made Carmen angry in a way that surprised her. She had always tried to be understanding, to see both sides, to navigate between cultures with grace and diplomacy. But this felt like a betrayal, like being told that her service wasn't wanted, that she wasn't good enough, that her desire to help didn't matter because of who she was. She had gone back to her work at the hospital, had tried to focus on her patients, but the anger remained simmering beneath the surface, waiting for an outlet. If you've ever been told you're not good enough, if you've ever been rejected because of who you are rather than what you can do, if you've ever felt a burning need to prove that the people who dismissed you were catastrophically wrong, then subscribe right now. Because this is the story of a woman who was banned from serving on the front line, who was told that her contribution wasn't needed, who then proceeded to accomplish something that military strategists said was impossible. Stay until the end, because what she did changed the course of the war in the Pacific in ways that no one could have predicted. The Japanese attack came on December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese aircraft struck American airfields in the Philippines, destroying most of the American Air Force on ground. And within days, Japanese troops were landing on the northern coast of Luzon, the main island of the Philippines. The invasion was swift and overwhelming, and despite MacArthur's preparations, the Filipino and American forces were quickly pushed back. Manila descended into chaos. The government declared it an open city, meaning it wouldn't be defended, in hopes of preventing its destruction. American and Filipino forces retreated to Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor, preparing for a last stand. Civilians fled the city or hunkered down in their homes, uncertain what Japanese occupation would mean, terrified of the stories they had heard about Japanese brutality in China. Carmen stayed at the hospital. As the military forces retreated, wounded soldiers flooded into Philippine General Hospital, far more than the facility could handle. The hallways filled with stretchers, the operating rooms ran continuously, and the staff worked to the point of collapse trying to save lives. Carmen worked 18-hour shifts, moving from patient to patient, doing triage, assisting in surgeries, providing comfort to men who were dying far from home. She saw American soldiers and Filipino soldiers, saw the wounds that modern warfare inflicted, saw young men with limbs blown off, with abdominal wounds that meant slow, agonizing deaths, with burns that covered most of their bodies. She saw the fear in their eyes, the pain, the desperate hope that someone could save them, and she did what she could, which often felt like not nearly enough. The Japanese entered Manila on January 2nd, 1942, and the occupation began. At first, the Japanese military tried to present themselves as liberators, freeing the Philippines from American colonialism, offering partnership in the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But the reality quickly became clear. This was not liberation but a new and harsher form of colonialism, with Japanese military authorities exercising absolute control, with brutal reprisals for any resistance, with a systematic exploitation of Filipino resources and labor. The hospital continued to operate, but under Japanese supervision. Japanese military doctors took over administrative control, and the staff was required to treat Japanese soldiers as well as Filipino civilians. Carmen found herself caring for the enemy, for soldiers of the army that had invaded her country, and she struggled with the ethical implications. These were human beings who were suffering, and her professional duty was to care for them. But they were also the invaders, the occupiers, the people who were destroying her country. She did her job, but she did it with a cold efficiency that was very different from the compassion she showed Filipino patients. The Japanese doctors noticed, and one of them, a Captain Tanaka, who served as the hospital's military liaison, called her into his office one day. "Nurse Rosales," he said in heavily accented English, "I have been observing you. You are skilled, but you show no warmth to Japanese patients. This is unacceptable. We are all human beings. We all deserve compassion. Carmen looked at him, this Japanese officer who was lecturing her about compassion while his army was brutalizing her country, and she felt a surge of anger so intense she had to clench her fist to keep from showing it. I provide medical care to all patients, she said, her voice carefully neutral. That is my professional duty. But not compassion, Tanaka said. Not humanity. You see us as enemies, not as people. You invaded my country, Carmen said, and she couldn't quite keep the edge out of her voice. You are occupying my city. You are killing my people, and you want me to show you compassion. Tanaka's expression hardened. You would do well to remember that we are in control now. Your attitude could be seen as resistance, and resistance is dealt with harshly. I am giving you a warning. Nurse Rosales, adjust your attitude, or there will be consequences. Carmen left his office shaking with anger and fear. She knew that Tanaka's threat was real, that the Japanese had been executing people for far less than what she had said. She needed to be more careful, needed to hide her feelings better. But the encounter had crystallized something in her mind. She couldn't fight the Japanese openly, couldn't join the guerrilla forces that were forming in the mountains because she had responsibilities at the hospital, had patients who needed her. But maybe there were other ways to resist, quieter ways, ways that used her position and her access to information. She started paying attention to things she had previously ignored. She noticed which Japanese officers came to the hospital, what their ranks were, what units they belonged to. She listened to conversations in Japanese, and while she didn't speak the language, she began to recognize certain words and phrases, began to understand the rhythms of military communication. She noticed patterns in when wounded soldiers arrived, which often correlated with military operations. She began to build a mental map of the Japanese military presence in Manila, of where units were stationed, of what their activities were. And she began to make contact with the resistance. It started small, with a patient who whispered to her that he was part of a guerrilla group, who asked if she could provide medical supplies. Carmen was terrified, knowing that helping the resistance could get her executed, but she also knew that this was her chance to do something, to fight back in the only way available to her. She started stealing small amounts of supplies, bandages and antiseptics and pain medication, passing them to resistance contacts who would slip into the hospital disguised as visitors or patients. Then the resistance asked for more. They wanted information about Japanese military activities, about troop movements and supply shipments, about the locations of headquarters and ammunition depots. Carmen was in position to gather this information, to observe and listen and remember, and she began to do so systematically. She would memorize what she saw and heard during the day, and then at night, she would write it down in a code she had developed, hiding the papers in a hollowed-out book in her room. Once a week, a resistance contact would come to the hospital, and Carmen would pass the information along, usually hidden in a package of medical supplies or tucked into a patient's belongings. It was terrifying work. Carmen lived in constant fear of being discovered, of being interrogated and tortured and executed. She had nightmares about Captain Tanaka finding her notes, about Japanese military police dragging her away, about her family being punished for her actions. But she also felt alive in a way she hadn't before, felt like she was finally doing something meaningful, finally fighting back against the occupation that had taken over her life. The resistance used her information to plan ambushes and sabotage operations, to avoid Japanese patrols, to identify targets for assassination. Carmen never knew the specific results of the intelligence she provided, but she heard about attacks on Japanese convoys, about officers who were killed, about supply depots that exploded, and she allowed herself to believe that her information had contributed to these successes. Months passed. The occupation ground on, becoming more brutal, as Japanese resources were stretched thin by the expanding war. Food became scarce, with the Japanese requisitioning most of the rice harvest and leaving Filipinos to survive on whatever they could find. Malnutrition became epidemic, and Carmen saw patients dying not from disease or injury, but from simple starvation. The Japanese implemented forced labor programs, conscripting Filipino men to build fortifications and airfields, working them to death under brutal conditions. And there were the atrocities, the random violence, the executions of suspected resistance members, the comfort women system that enslaved Filipino girls and women for the sexual use of Japanese soldiers. Carmen saw all of this, and her anger hardened into something cold and implacable. She continued her intelligence work, but she wanted to do more, wanted to strike a blow that would really hurt the Japanese. That would be more than just passing information. She started thinking about sabotage, about ways she could use her position to directly damage the Japanese war effort. The opportunity came in the summer of 1943. A Japanese naval officer was brought to the hospital with a severe infection, and Carmen was assigned to his care. His name was Commander Yamamoto, and he was the executive officer of a destroyer that was docked in Manila Bay for repairs. The ship, the Akatsuki, had been damaged in a naval engagement near the Solomon Islands and had limped back to Manila for extensive repairs that would take several weeks. Yamamoto was delirious with fever when he arrived, and Carmen worked to stabilize him, administering antibiotics and fluids, monitoring his vital signs. As he began to recover, he became talkative, grateful for the care he was receiving, and he began to tell Carmen about his ship, about the repairs that were being done, about the schedule for returning to active duty. He spoke in a mixture of Japanese and broken English, and Carmen listened carefully, filing away every detail. She learned that the Akatsuki was docked at Pier 7 in Manila Harbor, that the repairs included work on the ship's engines and weapon systems, that there was a skeleton crew aboard while most of the sailors were housed in barracks on shore. She learned that security was relatively light because the ship was in a secure harbor, that there were guards at the gangway but not extensive patrols of the ship itself. And she learned that the ship was scheduled to return to active duty in 2 weeks, after which it would rejoin the Japanese fleet and return to combat operations. Carmen began to formulate a plan. If she could sabotage the Akatsuki, could damage it severely enough that it couldn't return to service, she would be removing a significant asset from the Japanese fleet. A destroyer was a valuable ship, used for escort duty, anti-submarine warfare, and surface combat. Taking one out of action could save Allied lives, could contribute to the war effort in a tangible way. But how could she, a nurse with no military training, sabotage a warship? She couldn't just walk onto the ship and plant explosives. She didn't have access to explosives, didn't know how to use them, and wouldn't be able to get past the guards. She needed a different approach, something subtle, something that would use her skills and her access. She thought about what she knew about ships, which wasn't much. But she knew about engines, about the fact that they required fuel and lubricants to operate. And she knew about chemistry, about the fact that certain substances could contaminate fuel or lubricants, could cause engines to fail. She had access to the hospital's pharmacy, to chemicals and compounds that were used for medical purposes, but that could potentially be repurposed for sabotage. She started researching, reading medical textbooks and chemistry references, trying to figure out what substance would be most effective. She settled on a combination of compounds that, when mixed with diesel fuel, would create a sludge that would clog fuel lines and damage engine components. It wouldn't cause an immediate catastrophic failure, but it would cause progressive damage that would become apparent once the ship was at sea, when it was too late to easily return to port for repairs. The next challenge was getting the contaminated fuel onto the ship. Carmen couldn't do this herself, but she knew someone who could. One of her resistance contacts was a man named Miguel who worked at the harbor as a fuel truck driver, delivering diesel fuel to ships and military vehicles. Carmen approached him with her plan, and Miguel was initially skeptical. "You want me to contaminate the fuel for a Japanese warship?" he said. "Carmen, if they catch me, they'll torture me to death. And even if they don't catch me, how do we know this will work? What if the contamination isn't enough to cause real damage?" "It will work," Carmen said, with more confidence than she felt. "I've calculated the ratios. I've tested the compounds. If we can get enough of the contaminant into the ship's fuel tanks, it will cause significant engine damage. The ship will break down at sea, and the Japanese will lose a valuable asset." Miguel studied her for a long moment. "You've changed," he said. "When you first started helping us, you were scared, uncertain. Now you're planning to sabotage a warship. What happened to you?" Carmen thought about this question. What had happened to her? She had been rejected from military service, had been told she wasn't needed, had been dismissed as irrelevant. And then she had found ways to fight back, had discovered that she could be effective, could make a difference. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by determination, by anger, by a fierce desire to hurt the enemy in any way possible. "I got tired of being helpless," she said. "I got tired of watching the Japanese destroy my country and not being able to do anything about it. This is something I can do, something that will actually matter. Are you going to help me or not?" Miguel nodded slowly. "I'll help you, but we need to be careful. If this goes wrong, a lot of people could die, including us." They spent the next week preparing. Carmen synthesized the contaminating compounds in the hospital pharmacy, working late at night when no one else was around, carefully measuring and mixing chemicals, creating a substance that looked and smelled similar to diesel fuel, but that would cause progressive engine damage. She produced about 20 liters of the contaminant, storing it in medical containers that she smuggled out of the hospital in her nurse's bag. Miguel worked out the logistics of the fuel delivery. He would be making a routine delivery to the Akatsuki, filling the ship's fuel tanks as part of the normal resupply process. He would add Carmen's contaminant to his fuel truck, mixing it with the regular diesel, so that it would be pumped into the ship's tanks along with the legitimate fuel. The contamination would be diluted, but Carmen had calculated that even at a diluted concentration, it would be enough to cause significant damage once the ship's engines were running at operational temperatures and speeds. The day of the fuel delivery, Carmen was so nervous she could barely function. She went through her shift at the hospital in a daze, mechanically performing her duties while her mind was focused on what Miguel was doing at the harbor. She imagined 100 ways the plan could go wrong. Miguel could be searched and the contaminant discovered. The Japanese could test the fuel and detect the contamination. Something could go wrong with the mixing, and the contaminant could cause immediate obvious problems that would alert the Japanese. But nothing went wrong. Miguel made the delivery without incident, pumping thousands of liters of diesel fuel into the Akatsuki's tanks, the contaminated fuel mixing invisibly with clean fuel, settling into the ship's fuel system, like a time bomb waiting to detonate. He returned to his normal duties, and no one suspected anything. 2 weeks later, the Akatsuki left Manila Harbor, heading back to active duty in the Solomon Islands. Carmen heard about the departure from Commander Yamamoto, who had recovered from his infection and was returning to his ship. He thanked her for her care, told her that she was an excellent nurse, that he hoped the war would end soon so that Filipinos and Japanese could live in peace. Carmen smiled and nodded and wished him well, all while knowing that she had sabotaged his ship, that she had potentially condemned him and his crew to death at sea. She felt no guilt about this. Yamamoto was the enemy, and his ship would be used to kill Allied sailors and soldiers. If her sabotage worked, if the Akatsuki broke down at sea or suffered catastrophic engine failure, it would be one less Japanese warship threatening Allied forces. The fact that Yamamoto had been kind to her, had treated her with respect, didn't change the fundamental reality that he was part of an occupying army that was brutalizing her country. For weeks, Carmen heard nothing. She continued her work at the hospital, continued passing intelligence to the resistance, and waited to hear if her sabotage had been successful. She had no way of knowing what happened to the Akatsuki, whether the contaminated fuel had caused the damage she had intended, whether the ship had even made it out of Philippine waters. Then, 2 months after the Akatsuki had left Manila, Carmen overheard a conversation between Japanese officers at the hospital. They were discussing a naval disaster, a destroyer that had suffered catastrophic engine failure during a combat operation near Bougainville. The ship had lost power in the middle of a battle, had been unable to maneuver, and had been sunk by American aircraft. Most of the crew had been killed, including the executive officer, Commander Yamamoto. The ship was the Akatsuki. Carmen felt a complex mixture of emotions, triumph that her sabotage had worked, that she had successfully destroyed a Japanese warship, horror at the scale of what she had done, at the fact that she had killed dozens of men, and a cold satisfaction that she had struck a real blow against the enemy, that she had proven that even someone banned on the front line could make a significant contribution to the war effort. She told no one about what she had done, not even her resistance contacts. This was her secret, her private victory, and she carried it with her through the rest of the war. She continued her intelligence work, continued stealing medical supplies for the guerrillas, continued surviving under Japanese occupation. and she waited for liberation, for the day when American forces would return and free the Philippines from Japanese control. That liberation came in 1945, after 3 years of brutal occupation. American forces landed on Luzon in January, and the Battle for Manila was one of the most destructive urban battles of the entire war. The Japanese refused to surrender, fought to the death in the streets and buildings of the city, and in the process destroyed much of Manila. Over 100,000 Filipino civilians were killed, caught in the crossfire, or deliberately murdered by Japanese troops in a final orgy of violence. Carmen survived the battle for Manila, sheltering in the hospital basement, while the city was torn apart above her. When American forces finally secured the area, she emerged to find a city in ruins, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, bodies lying in the streets, the smell of death everywhere. The hospital had been damaged but was still standing, and Carmen immediately went back to work, treating wounded soldiers and civilians, doing what she had always done, providing care in the midst of chaos. After the war, Carmen tried to return to normal life, but she found that normal no longer existed. The Philippines had been devastated by the occupation and the liberation, with hundreds of thousands dead, the economy destroyed, the infrastructure in ruins. The country gained its independence in 1946, finally achieving the self-governance that had been promised for so long, but it was a hollow victory. Independence granted to a nation that had been shattered by war. Carmen continued working as a nurse, helping with a massive reconstruction effort, treating patients who were suffering from malnutrition and disease and the lingering effects of trauma. But she was changed by her wartime experiences, by the things she had seen and done, by the secret she carried about the Akatsuki. She had killed dozens of men, had sabotaged a warship, had been a spy and a saboteur, and she had done it all while maintaining the facade of being just a nurse, just a woman doing her job. She never told anyone about the Akatsuki. The resistance members she had worked with knew about her intelligence gathering, but they didn't know about the sabotage. Miguel knew, but he had been killed during the battle for Manila, and his knowledge had died with him. Carmen kept the secret, partly because she wasn't sure anyone would believe her, partly because she wasn't sure how to talk about it, how to explain what she had done and why. In the 1950s, Carmen married a doctor she had worked with during the war, and they had 3 children. She continued nursing for several more years, then retired to focus on raising her family. She lived a quiet life, unremarkable on the surface, and most people who knew her had no idea what she had done during the war, what she had accomplished, what she had sacrificed. It wasn't until the 1970s that Carmen's story began to emerge. A historian researching the Philippine resistance movement interviewed her about her intelligence work, and during the interview, Carmen mentioned the Akatsuki almost casually, as if it were a minor detail. The historian was stunned and pressed for more information, and Carmen, now in her 60s and feeling that enough time had passed, told the full story. The historian verified what he could through Japanese and American naval records. The Akatsuki had indeed suffered catastrophic engine failure during a battle near Bougainville in 1943, had been unable to maneuver, and had been sunk with heavy loss of life. Japanese post-war investigations had attributed the engine failure to mechanical defects or possibly sabotage, but they had never identified the source. The timing matched Carmen's account, and the nature of the engine failure was consistent with fuel contamination. The story was published in a historical journal, and Carmen suddenly found herself being celebrated as a war hero, as someone who had accomplished something extraordinary. She was invited to speak at universities and veterans organizations, was interviewed by journalists, was awarded medals and honors by the Philippine government. She was uncomfortable with the attention, feeling that she didn't deserve to be celebrated for killing people, even enemy soldiers. "I did what I thought was necessary," she said in one interview. "I was angry that I had been rejected from military service, angry that I was told I couldn't contribute to the war effort. So I found my own way to fight back. But I don't think what I did should be glorified. War is terrible, and killing is terrible, even when it's necessary. I'm proud that I resisted, that I didn't just accept the occupation passively. But I'm not proud of the killing. I'm not proud that dozens of men died because of what I did." The interviewer asked her if she regretted sabotaging the Akatsuki, and Carmen thought about this for a long time before answering. "I don't regret it," she finally said. Those men would have gone on to kill Allied sailors and soldiers. That ship would have been used to support the Japanese war effort, to prolong the occupation of my country. By taking it out of action, I saved lives, even if I had to take lives to do it. But I wish it hadn't been necessary. I wish the war had never happened, that the Japanese had never invaded, that I had never been put in a position where sabotaging a warship seemed like the right thing to do. Carmen's story challenged assumptions about women in war, about what civilians could accomplish, about the nature of resistance. She had been banned from serving on the front line, had been told that her contribution wasn't needed, and she had responded by accomplishing something that trained military personnel would have struggled to achieve. She had used her position as a nurse, her access to the hospital and the Japanese officers, her knowledge of chemistry and her intelligence and her courage, to strike a blow against the enemy that had real strategic impact. But her story also illustrated the moral complexity of war, the way that necessary actions could still be morally troubling, the way that heroism and tragedy were intertwined. Carmen had killed dozens of men, and while those men were enemy soldiers, they were still human beings with families and hopes and dreams. She had made a choice to prioritize the lives of Allied soldiers and Filipino civilians over the lives of Japanese sailors, and it was the right choice given the circumstances, but it was still a choice that carried moral weight. In her later years, Carmen became an advocate for peace and for women's rights. She spoke about her wartime experiences not to glorify war, but to illustrate the capabilities of women, to challenge the assumptions that had led to her being banned from military service in the first place. She argued that women should have the same opportunities as men to serve their countries, to contribute to defense efforts, to be recognized as full and equal citizens. They banned me from the front line because I was a woman, she said in a speech at the University of the Philippines in 1985. They assumed that women couldn't handle combat, couldn't make the hard decisions, couldn't be effective in war. But I proved them wrong. I wasn't on the front line in the traditional sense, but I was fighting just as surely as any soldier. And I was effective. I accomplished something significant. Not because I was exceptional, but because I was determined, because I refused to accept that my contribution didn't matter. She continued, "But I also want you to understand that war is not glorious. What I did was necessary, but it was also terrible. I killed people. I carry that with me every day. And I want you to understand that before you celebrate war, before you glorify military service, you need to understand the cost. The real cost, not just in lives lost, but in the moral and psychological burden that soldiers and resistance fighters carry for the rest of their lives." Carmen died in 1998 at the age of 84. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including veterans of the Philippine resistance, former patients she had treated, students she had mentored, and government officials who wanted to honor her service. She was buried with military honors, and her grave became a site of remembrance, a place where people came to honor not just her, but all the Filipino women who had resisted Japanese occupation, who had fought back in whatever ways they could, who had refused to accept defeat. In the years since her death, Carmen's story has been told and retold, in books and films and documentaries. She has become a symbol of Filipino resistance, of women's capabilities, of the power, determination, and courage. But these retellings often simplify her story, turning her into a straightforward hero when the reality was much more complex. Carmen was a hero, but she was also a person who struggled with what she had done, who carried guilt and trauma, who questioned whether the ends justified the means. She was someone who had been rejected and dismissed, who had turned that rejection into motivation, who had proven that the people who underestimated her were catastrophically wrong. But she was also someone who understood that proving people wrong through violence, even necessary violence, came at a cost that couldn't be ignored or minimized. The title, "The Woman Who Sabotaged a Japanese Warship," is accurate, but it's also incomplete. Carmen was a nurse, a spy, a saboteur, a wife, a mother, an advocate, a teacher. She was someone who lived through one of the most brutal occupations of World War II, who found ways to resist and fight back, who accomplished something extraordinary, and who then spent the rest of her life trying to make sense of what she had done and what it meant. When they banned her from the front line, they thought they were protecting her, or perhaps they thought she wasn't capable, or perhaps they simply didn't think women belonged in combat roles. Whatever their reasoning, they were wrong. Carmen didn't need to be on the front line to fight effectively. She found her own way to contribute, used her skills and her position and her intelligence to strike a blow against the enemy that had real strategic impact. The sabotage of the Akatsuki was a remarkable achievement. A civilian nurse, working alone with minimal resources, had successfully destroyed a Japanese warship, removing from service and killing dozens of enemy sailors. It was the kind of operation that military special forces would plan for months, that would require extensive training and specialized equipment. Carmen did it with chemistry knowledge, determination, and the help of one resistance contact. But the achievement came with a cost. Carmen lived with the knowledge that she had killed dozens of men, that she had sent them to the bottom of the ocean, that their families had mourned them without ever knowing that their deaths were caused by a Filipino nurse who had contaminated their ship's fuel. She didn't regret the action, but she carried the weight of it, understood that necessary killing was still killing, that justified violence was still violence. Her story challenges us to think about war in more complex ways, to understand that resistance and heroism are not simple or straightforward, that the people who fight back against oppression often pay terrible prices for their actions. It challenges us to recognize the capabilities of people we might dismiss or underestimate, to understand that women, civilians, people without military training can be just as effective as trained soldiers when they're motivated and determined. And it challenges us to honor not just the achievements of people like Carmen, but also their struggles, their doubts, their moral complexity. She was a hero, but she was a reluctant hero, someone who did what she thought was necessary, but who never stopped questioning whether it was right, who never stopped carrying the burden of what she had done. They banned her from the front line, thinking that would keep her out of the war. Instead, it forced her to find her own way to fight, to become a different kind of warrior, to prove that the front line is wherever people choose to resist, wherever people refuse to accept oppression, wherever people find the courage to fight back against overwhelming odds. Carmen Rosales sabotaged a Japanese warship, and in doing so, she changed the course of the war in the Pacific in a small but significant way. She saved Allied lives, contributed to the eventual liberation of the Philippines, and proved that even someone banned from military service could make a crucial difference. But more than that, she showed us what resistance looks like, what courage costs, and what it means to fight for your country and your principles, even when the world tells you that your contribution doesn't matter. Her legacy is not just the ship she destroyed, but the example she set, the proof she provided that determination and intelligence and courage can overcome barriers and restrictions, that people who are dismissed and underestimated can accomplish extraordinary things, and that the fight against oppression takes many forms, not all of them on traditional battlefields. Carmen taught us that being banned from the front line doesn't mean you can't fight, that being told you're not needed doesn't mean you can't contribute, that being dismissed because of who you are doesn't define what you can accomplish. She taught us that resistance is creative, that it finds ways around obstacles, that it uses whatever tools and opportunities are available. And she taught us that heroism is complicated, that it comes with costs and burdens, that it should be honored but also understood in all its moral complexity. When soldiers mocked her, when officials rejected her application, when the military told her she wasn't needed, they made a fundamental mistake. They judged her by her gender and her civilian status rather than by her capabilities and her determination. And Carmen spent the rest of the war proving them wrong, accomplishing things they said were impossible, fighting back in ways they never imagined. She sabotaged a Japanese warship. She gathered intelligence that saved lives. She resisted occupation in whatever ways she could, and she did it all while maintaining her cover as just a nurse, just a woman doing her job, just someone who wasn't supposed to matter in the grand scheme of the war. But she did matter. She mattered enormously, and her story, finally told and recognized, stands as a testament to the power of determination, the capabilities of women, the creativity of resistance, and the complex reality of heroism in war. Carmen Rosales was banned from the front line, but she fought anyway, and what she accomplished changed history in ways that the people who banned her could never have imagined.